It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp, and we're so excited to be back for Season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. This week I'm joined by first-time guest Stephanie Malench. She's a writer and a consultant, and she just bought a digital newspaper, so we're talking consistent messaging for nonprofits. It's September 9, 2024. Welcome to episode 253. Hey everybody, it's Monday, September 9th, and that means it's time for another episode of Radio Free 501c, brought to you by Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips, and I'm so glad you're here with us for this week's episode. It's a really great topic that we don't think enough about: consistent messaging for nonprofits. And like an old boss of mine used to say, consistency is important in more things than cake batter. So before we jump into our conversation, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our global audience. And thanks again for joining us. We are having a year of first-time guests, and we have yet another first-time guest with us this week, Stephanie Malench. She is a writer, editor, and now newspaper publisher, and she's here to talk with us about how we can have more consistent messaging, especially for all nonprofits. Stephanie, welcome to the show. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about yourself?
Sure. My name is Stephanie Malench. I own, it's actually Malench Publishing LLC now, and I've got two legs under there. Write by Steph, which is a full-service professional business writing and editing agency. And then I also recently became the publisher of the Collinsville Daily News, which is a digital newspaper. They actually go well together. For almost a year, I wrote a regular column on the business page about nonprofit issues, getting set up, consistency, what the differences are between all the different 501s. There's like a whole alphabet soup. There's A, B, C, F, all of them, and different resources available to nonprofits. And then on my Write by Steph side, I do blog writing, I do website content, landing pages in addition to the blog. I help with business plans for both nonprofit geared and regular for profit. I help with the publication materials. So if you have a newsletter you want to send out or a brochure you need written, mission statement, vision statement, I do it all. I have a history of volunteering and being on boards of 501c3s. I've done that for over almost 30 years now. Oof. I wish I wouldn't have thought back on that. I was the recording secretary when I was 18 years old, and it was my job to send the thank you letters to all the donors, and that was a huge job.
Wow. That's great, though, that it was a huge job, because that means you're getting lots of donations. That's wonderful. Well, you do it all, like a lot of us solopreneur consultants, and congratulations on the newspaper.
Thank you.
Well, what we're here to talk about consistent messaging. We may pop in a few other things because, like myself, Stephanie has a broad experience and understanding of all things nonprofit. And I have to say, it's so refreshing to meet someone who knows there is more than 501c3 or C6, because there's actually 27 501c types that you can be, including a 501c19, which is a group for military veterans. So there's your little CAE learning for this week, folks, out there in the audience. But there's a whole world of nonprofits out there. But again, if they are not getting their message out, they're kind of dead in the water. So what are some of the problems that you see, Stephanie, when you're working with nonprofits and they're trying to get that message crafted and get it out to a broad audience?
I would have to say the biggest one is not having a foundational mission and vision statement. They may have had one when they incorporated, which I recently learned through one of my nonprofit consulting clients, at least here in Illinois. You didn't have to incorporate back in the 1960s. My client has been, agency has been around for over 60 years now that I'm working with. And when they were founded, they didn't have to do incorporation paperwork. So I'm helping them get all that done and their articles and their bylaws. And the bylaws may say one thing, but then as different boards come along, they start steering away from that and they forget what their original mission is.
That's right.
So keeping that basic thing, and as different technologies and different platforms come up, again, there was no internet. They didn't have to worry about, okay, I have to explain what I do in this few characters, or I have to explain it in this many characters to get Google rankings. So it's important to have the same core message and just be able to expound upon it, but the core is the same. That's why it's good to have paper documents to go back on. If you're giving one message to your donors and another message to your clients, you're not gonna necessarily get a good fit. You're going to confuse people because someone from the donor side might know someone that wants to be a client, and they'll talk about the agency and they'll be like, that's not what I need. I don't think you understand my situation. So it's
Right.
important to know who you're talking to and be consistent within that group also.
And that's such an excellent point about it all starts with writing the mission statement, the vision statement, if you have core values, what your message is going to be to the public, your bylaws, your articles of incorporation. The articles of incorporation have what we call the statement of purpose, and that's going to be phrased a little bit differently than what your mission is, because your statement of purpose is why you're here. Your mission is what you're going to do. And I think a lot of people lose track of that. So I think those are all really good points. And that's really interesting about the incorporation rules back in the 60s, because a lot of people don't understand that that has evolved, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And if you're incorporated as a state nonprofit, that's different from being a 501c at the federal level. And so those are two levels of things. Like here in Maryland, we have what are called non-stock corporations, which means that you're here to help the community as opposed to give people dividends, which is basically what a 501c does. But I think, I love that you're making that point. It all comes down to clear, consistent messaging. Are we staying on mission? Are we staying on point? And are we sending that same message? Now, what's your opinion about the different ways you do have to talk to the different audiences, though? So you give one message, not different messages, but you want donors to know something different than clients. So what are some ways that nonprofits can keep the spirit consistent?
Focus on what you've accomplished, how many like loaves of bread. If you're a homeless agency, I had a client for a while that worked with the homeless, and they refused to track how many loaves of bread they gave out or how many blankets or coats. I'm like, well, you have to record this because if we get this grant, they're going to ask that. They go, well, we want to hang out with the homeless. I'm like, okay, but that's not the role of the board of directors. They go, well, that's the way we do things. I'm like, well, maybe you need to have a separate board, a client relations board that actually goes out and does the nitty gritty work, and another one that does all the formal work. They didn't like that idea. Somehow they're still around, but they've had to give back a couple grants. So
Oh, it's amazing how many hang on by a thread, and they're living on angel checks many times, or somebody who's emotionally attached to the organization and will put that extra 10 hours in a month or pay out of their own pocket for something. And this is a sad statement on how nonprofits get formed sometimes and how little education they actually get. And I think that's messaging that the nonprofit management profession could do better, is this is a real important responsibility that you're taking on, especially at the board level. It's the board's job for oversight. That is how the IRS defines it. The board exists for oversight. They're not there to manage or run operations. They're there to provide oversight and set direction and make sure that we're staying on mission. And if there is paid staff, then it's their job to oversee the paid staff, not to be their boss or manage them. It's a relationship that's a partnership. So if we could get that message out, it sounds to me like what they want to be is volunteers, hands-on volunteers, not the stewards of the organization.
Exactly.
So how do we fix that? Can we fix it?
Hiring a professional writer or editor such as myself is a great start. On the editing end, you can bring me all of your existing or send me all your existing documentation, and I can go through it and I can look for those key words that tend to pull at people's heartstrings now. And if something contradicts, if your program descriptions contradict your mission or vision statement, I might ask you, well, why is this the programming you're offering? How does this tie back to your mission and vision? And they might go, no one's ever asked us that before. I guess we are starting to steer away. Will you help us create a new program description or a new mission and vision? Because this is the programming we want to do. How can we tie everything back to that?
Well, and I think that is a great service. And I know as a consultant, I also try to provide what people start calling them guardrails. But I think it's guidance more than anything else. Just make sure you're staying true to the mission and understanding that role that you have decided to take on for yourself, whether you're a volunteer in a committee or a volunteer in the board of directors, or if you're in a service nonprofit, being hands-on with the people that you're trying to help. Because there's so many different kinds of nonprofits, as we've touched on, and they all have to stay on mission. It's when they start to veer off mission that problems start to arise. And unfortunately, if we don't get better messaging out there, nonprofits may cease to exist. And I'm not
It's
saying that.
also really important to make sure that if you need to pull back and stop giving services or anything for a while, that you still are filing your 990s and you're still doing everything. Because I had another client, I seem to get all the train wreck clients. She applied for a 501c3 many, many years ago because she knew she eventually wanted to do something. And then last year, when I got ready to start writing grants for her, I went to look up her 501c3 number, and she had never filed anything, and she had never done any of her documentation or done any fundraisers or done anything. And so they dissolved it. So she no longer has a 501c3 that she thought she had. So I couldn't write grants for her.
And I hate to say it, but I would like to see that happen more often. I remember many years ago, I was at a reception at a conference, and I got into something of a mini argument with someone who said there's too many nonprofits. And at the time, this is, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I felt offended. I was like, no, how can you say that? This is our chosen profession. Well, fast forward to today, and I realized that about 5 years ago that he was right. There are too many nonprofits. And why are there too many nonprofits? Because too many people think it's like a hobby. That example you just gave is a perfect example of what I call a dining room table nonprofit. Somebody gets an idea and they say, oh, well, I'm going to start a nonprofit. And they have no idea that it's an actual incorporation status, that you have rules you have to follow, you have laws you have to comply with, you have forms that need to be done. And it's not a hobby. It's a different kind of organization, and we're meant to elevate the world around us and help people. And there's so many nonprofits. If all the nonprofits stayed focused on just their core mission, the world would already be a better place because we're doing what we can in our area of service. So if we're serving a professional society or a trade association or a foundation or a charity, we're helping make the world a better place, because by making a profession better or an industry better or feeding the hungry or educating people who want knowledge, helping the homeless, we're making the world a better place by doing that part and staying focused.
And I had another client that, like, I was trying to do a grant for them. They let their webpage disappear. They didn't pay for their webpage. So the grant required a webpage as part of the application because they want to see how you're involved in the community. And they didn't have one. I knew they used to because I had been on it when I tried writing a previous grant. And when I asked the founder, I'm like, what happened to your webpage? Oh, the person that was in charge of that didn't renew it. I'm like, well, you've paid me, I'm going to write the grant, but I'm going to let you know you are not going to get it because that's a required question. If the foundations and different donors, if they don't know you exist, they can't give you money.
Wow. Do you have other examples like that of nonprofits letting things expire or not taking them out of draft?
Those are the two big ones. The one that that bought the 501, well, not bought, but registered for the 501(c)(3) years ago and never used it. And then this one, this agency's actually decided to do a reset. I offered to consult them and they said amazingly, they don't have the money to pay a consultant because they never had any fundraisers. And that's important too. You've got to have fundraisers. If you're not bringing money in, you're doing your mission a huge disservice.
That's right, because we all know the old saying, no margin, no mission. Because we have to have the resources. We don't want to be driven by profit or revenue, but we need it, or we can't do what we want to do. We can't get the resources that we need to help people, whether that's paid staff or buying food to distribute to people who need it. We need to have the money and the time and the energy to make these things happen. So I think that's a really good point. And this is the problem, again, of the misconception that running a nonprofit is easy simply because it's nonprofit. It's still an incorporation status. And so that means, again, there are certain procedures, operations, laws that need to be complied with. You need to understand what all the documents are, because I've actually had people try to rewrite their articles of incorporation. It's like, why? That's a done deal. Once it's filed and you're incorporated, that's done. What you need to focus on is updating your bylaws and keeping the bylaws updated. And then the strategic plan would be your next document. And that's what helps you fulfill your mission. And then you have your policies and procedures, which mean those are the ways that we make sure things get done or how we're going to handle things. And like things like making sure the webpage gets renewed, there has to be a process and there has to be accountability that goes along with the responsibility. And I think, coming back to your point about consistent messaging, making sure that the people who are involved in the nonprofit, whether they're using paid staff or they're volunteer run, that they are staying on top of these things and that they're consistently letting people know within their volunteer group, well, this is what needs to happen. Here's how we're doing it. And here's what we want to keep telling people. Is that something that you deal with sometimes with your clients?
Absolutely. And there's so many different ways to get your message out now compared to previously. It's like you've got the opportunity to write a blog regularly, tell a client success story. That's one of the biggest things that you can do to stay relevant and to have a consistent message. Because if you're writing about what you've already done with one client, you're going to be attracting more clients like that through writing about how you help them.
And
And
that's,
go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, yes, that's so important. You have to show how many people have we helped this month? How many people moved on and became successful because they were able to access our service? That sort of example.
And like this podcasts, people that don't like to write, they can go talk about what they've done. Different local radio shows, seminars, webinars. There's so many different ways. Just get yourself out there and don't rely. This is going back away from our topic a little bit, but don't pick all your family members just to fill in the required 4 people to have on your board of directors. Be vetting people for what their specialties are. Don't have someone as a treasurer that's filed for bankruptcy. Having someone as your president that doesn't like to lead, that is afraid of confrontation, is not good. Everyone needs to have a niche, and everyone needs to get along and be willing to disagree and have discussions. That's a consistent message too. Are you willing to talk about where you are and where you want to be? And if 2 people see things differently, are you willing to work that out and maybe come to a compromise?
That is so important. And I love your comment about don't fill the board with your relatives because I think that's a recipe for disaster. I think there's a lot of yeah, okay, and everybody save the angry postcards. I think there's a lot of family founded foundations that struggle for that reason. And I think a lot of their resources are not used well because they say, oh, let's start a foundation in memory of a family member. Oh, well, that's nice. But why not just start a scholarship fund through another group? If you want to honor someone's memory and help people, you don't have to start yet another nonprofit. And especially, again, I love that you brought that up. Make sure the people are vetted and actually can do the job you'd like them to do. And don't make your board too big unless you're getting a lot of money. If you're getting lots of donations and you're C3 and people would like to be on your board of directors, if your bylaws allow that because they've donated, they're in, they've made that commitment, that's okay, but don't make your working board of directors so big that nothing actually gets accomplished. And you see both ends of the spectrum, too few board members or too many board members. And I've decided, not randomly, just based on my years of experience, I think 7 to 10 is about as big as any board needs to be because that's your
Absolutely.
yeah, it's your three minimum board members that the IRS requires, and then your four officers. And that's seven. That's all you need right there. And
Yep.
everybody else is a committee. So, and the importance of getting experienced people like yourself and myself to come in and give that advice and share that information and knowledge and help them get organized and streamlined and get their operations going. Because again, it all comes back to consistent messaging, whether you're reaching your external audience or talking to each other internally.
I remember I had an experience out of grad school. I was the volunteer executive director for a
Hmm.
religious group that it was a subset of a religious group. And I did not realize at that time, because I was used to being on the other side of the table, that the executive director, the board is actually their boss. I was responsible to 43 board members, and they were all over the age of 65, and they had horse blinders on. They would not look past their own perspective for things. And you don't want to rubber stamp things either. It's okay to disagree, but don't just rubber stamp. One person would say something, everyone else would be like, oh, yep, that's the way we're going to do it. Nope, no one else can tell us to do something different.
They don't want to hear it. And
Nope.
that is the downfall of every unsuccessful board. And there are still groups out there struggling along or managing to hold it together year to year. But it's though they're not successful because they're just holding it together. They're struggling and the board doesn't want to hear it. They don't want to listen. And the biggest problem I find, and this is to your great example, they want the status quo with different outcomes. And that does not happen. And again, the misconception that the board is the boss of the executive director, that is a misconception that keeps getting passed on. And I've been doing some blog posts about that. Oversight is not the same thing as being the boss. The boss means they are your employee and you tell them what to do. That is not the same relationship between a board and the chief staff executive. It just isn't. They're supposed to be partners. Oversight means that they monitor the performance of the chief staff executive. And I'm saying this again, I've said this many times over the last year, and I'm saying it again. The role of the board is oversight. They are to oversee the performance of the chief staff executive. If that person's performance falls below what the expectations are, that's when the board steps in and takes action. Otherwise, you let that person do their job because they're the chief staff executive. They are the top staff person at that organization. You work together. You are not the boss. You want to know why? Because it's not your job to be the boss. And that's another message, speaking of consistent messaging, that we need to get out there. Because unfortunately, the consistent messaging has been the board is the boss. You report to the board. It's like, well, you know what? Reporting to someone, sharing information with them is not the same thing as being their employee. And I had one chief staff executive job that actually it was kind of funny in a black comedy kind of way, looking back, they actually they hired me the same day they interviewed me. I was one of the finalists, and they didn't give me any time to think about it. They were like, "You have to say yes or no right now." And I was like, well, all right, I'll say yes, because I want the job. But they actually handed me a photocopied letter of agreement with fill in the blank lines in it. And that right there should have been a warning. I was just like, what is this? I'm not signing this. And then we had to go back and forth for a while. But well, we're your boss. And it's like, well, no, not really, because I'm being hired to do this job, but I'm doing the job, not you. And just like all this riotous stuff, like saying that I accrued vacation like the rest of the staff. And I'm like, no, I don't, because I'm the chief staff exec. It's like the lack of board education is really frightening sometimes. And despite the fact that we do consistently message from the profession, you need to educate the board, but you can't educate people who don't want to learn. Because, like, again, your point, working with so many people who did not want to hear a different perspective and didn't want to change the way they were doing things. You can't teach people like that. You can't educate them, no matter how hard you try.
And the funny, again, black comedy part of that was they ended up, even though I interviewed to be the paid executive director of that group, they ended up hiring someone that had just been fired from another department because it was a Jewish organization and she knew the rules because it was a
Uh,
health organization. So I went to the health fairs. Sorry, the health fairs are all on Saturday. I have never, even in the 20 years since, seen a health fair on a Sunday. And they're like, you can't go to those. I'm like, well, I'm not Jewish, and that's when all the events are. They go, well, we don't care. You can't be doing that. I'm like, okay, how are we going to get our message out? Crickets. So they went with this other person that wouldn't rock the boat and also pretty much wouldn't do anything. And they were they were so archaic too, in that I had a friend that had a business that was consolidating, that he wanted to donate a large printer. They didn't want it because they needed something for their volunteers to do. So the volunteers would collate the 10-page newsletter, paper newsletter, by walking around the table and putting it together and stapling it and then hand labeling it. They felt that was a better a good use of their volunteers.
that's just stupid. Sorry, I'm from Missouri. That's just stupid. If you are wasting people's time, that is a waste of time. I even we used to do that with board books because we're all when remember when we used to do the 3-ring board binders,
Mhm.
the staff would do that. We would walk around and do that. But nobody does that anymore. Or why not just send it out to Kinko's? They'll do it to you, or do it for you, I should say. FedEx, I think it's FedEx Kinko's now, but you just send out, they'll do it for you. They'll even put the labels on if you want. I mean, it's amazing what you can do. But again, boards thinking that they know what they're doing is probably the most dangerous thing to the nonprofit status out there today. And I will say that. And yes, if you are an offended board member, because you think you're a good board member, offense is not meant, but we need to educate ourselves about if we're doing our job to the best of our ability, even if we're a volunteer. So we need to ask these questions.
And another consistent language thing and message thing, make sure you've got a lawyer or an attorney or some kind of legal representative in your back pocket at all times, because if you say one thing wrong, especially in today's day and age, you could be in huge trouble
That's
and
right.
actually lose your nonprofit status.
It's easier to do than people think. It really is. And another thing people don't realize, which is why, as a profession, as whether you're on staff or you're a consultant or an industry partner, we're all part of the nonprofit profession. And we need our consistent messaging to get out there to show that we are trying to improve, that we're aware of the laws. We know we need a lawyer. We know we need an accountant. We know we should have an outside audit at least every couple of years to keep the finances uh, above board and well controlled. But what a lot of people don't realize is there are people in the United States that do not think we should have a nonprofit status. They think it should go away, and that it shouldn't be exempt from federal taxes or get special treatment of any kind. And I think considering we don't really get that much special treatment at most levels, the only special treatment we get is that we don't have to pay federal income tax on revenue, but we still might have to pay in the state. depending on the state law of where we're doing business or where we're incorporated. Some states will let you get a letter saying you don't have to pay sales tax if you're buying things, but not every state. So it's
Right.
very different. It's very different. And we have a lot of activist state attorney generals that are going after nonprofits for that reason because they want to get rid of them. One of the big changes coming up in 2025 for taxes, which is another completely different topic, which I am trying to find a webinar I can go to about it. The tax changes when the previous tax reform expires next year. So now there are people in Congress who want to start taxing membership dues and taxing other things that nonprofits of all kinds collect, conference registrations, that supports our mission. It's not UBIT, but now they want to tax it. So how is that going to impact us if that actually changes in that direction? Or can we get Congress to change its mind and make a different law or maybe renew those reforms so we don't have to do that again? But again, it's that underlying thing. There are people who are against it. And so we need to make sure we're getting our consistent message out to make sure that they know why we're important, why we're here. We serve a unique and special and important role in society.
Especially the churches. I feel like the churches are the backbone of the nonprofit community. And within the last 10 years, the proliferation of all these mega churches where you've got the pastors living in mansions, there's people that are like, tax all the churches. I'm like, okay, tax all the churches. Your food pantries are going to disappear. Your orphanages are going to disappear.
Right.
Your homeless outreach, it's all going to disappear if we start taxing the churches because they're the ones that do the services and they're already on a shoestring budget.
Right. And I think, that's such a good point, Stephanie, because the mega churches have made all churches look bad. And they're not. I know there's been a lot of scandals, but this kind of leads us back into why ethics is so important for nonprofits, ethics for board members, for donors, for members, or the people who are being served by a nonprofit. It's so important to be ethical and be above board and take responsibility because all we have really is our reputation of the good that we do for the world. And if that reputation is shattered, which unfortunately scandals eat away at it, then we're going to lose. We're not going to maintain our space and we're going to be eliminated. And you're right, the world will be far worse off without nonprofits.
And that's consistent message. What are you going to do if someone does something that is unethical? Did they sign a code of conduct or a ethical stipulation saying that if they do something that they're not supposed to, the board has, or the executive director, depending on which end of the table they're on, has the authority to get rid of that person before it brings down the whole ship?
That's right. That's right. A code of conduct needs to be enforceable. You're absolutely right. Or it's meaningless. It's a paper tiger. It's not going to help unless you have a group of ethical people who will do it anyway without you having an enforcement policy. But unfortunately, not all people work that way. So, well, this has been a great conversation. I'm so glad we kind of went off into all the other different directions, different messaging things, because again, writing is the backbone of everything because we have to have our clear message out there. But Stephanie, before we wrap up for this episode, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And how can they get in touch with you if they would like to learn more about all your different endeavors?
Um, just be specific and be consistent. Even when you're writing your budget, which is, you think it's mostly numbers, you need to give a good description of what each of those numbers means. Office supplies. Well, what is an office supply? Is it only for people that are working in the building or is it for people that work from home? What is considered if a lot of nonprofits like to give to another nonprofit as part of their way of giving back, what is your criteria for giving that donation? Is it vetted? Or again, vetting is a big deal to me. If you're just putting people and procedures in place to say you've checked that box off, that's not good. The easiest way to get a hold of me is my email, writebysteph, WRITEBYSTPEH gmail.com, or you can call or text me at 314-952-7525. And that's for both consulting and writing.
Well, that's excellent. And can you give us one more shout out for your digital newspaper?
Yes, the Collinsville Daily News. It is online, collinsvilledailynews.com. We have no paywalls and no subscriptions. So any support you can do, collinsvilledailynews.com. We actually have a donation button at the top. If you go to the Collinsville Daily News Facebook page, if you're someone that's still on Facebook, there's a GoFundMe page for that to help keep journalism free when we don't have the message anymore of what's going on in our world. That's when things are going to get really bad, when things are hidden from us.
That's right. Oh, that's a great point. So, well, thank you again, Stephanie, for joining me this week. Everyone, Stephanie Malench of Right by Steph, and also many other areas of nonprofit consulting. Always great to meet a fellow solopreneur.
Thanks.
Well, it's time for us to go rogue, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So if you have forgotten to follow us or subscribe or keep putting that off, please do so you don't miss any of our future episodes. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box, check out our website, roguetulips.com. You can also find information about the fall session of the Rogue Tulips Education Program for those who want to learn more about ethics, or you're getting ready for the CAE exam in December, or you just want to get some more CAE renewal credits. We have a couple courses and options for you to check out. So roguetulips.com. On behalf of Stephanie and myself, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.